Welcome to Talking Geopolitics from Geopolitical Futures. I'm Christian Smith, coming to you from London, where locals are blinking into the light as one of the world's longest lockdowns is starting to come to an end. But we're not stopping in London on this episode. With the recent build-up of forces on the Ukrainian border, along with foreign cyber attacks aplenty and Alexei Navalny's anti-government protests, Russia has been far from lacking attention in recent months. So, on this episode of Talking Geopolitics, we're heading east to try and understand why Russia does what it does. For Russia, history is long, and war, like death and taxes, is one of life's few constants. While we in the West might consider that old great power wars are no longer possible, the Kremlin is more doubtful. Chairman George Friedman spent decades studying the USSR, and later in the show, he tells us why 30 years after Mikhail Gorbachev threw in the towel, Russian foreign policy is still based on old assumptions. Also, our analyst in Moscow, Ekaterina Zolotova, will guide us through how Russia's geography, economy, and military drives its geopolitics. But before we head to Russia, Joe Biden just became the first US president to formally recognize the Armenian genocide of 1915. And Philip Orchard is here to explain why that's not really appearing on his geopolitical radar.
Well, in truth, I think this is a pretty low-stakes move for the Biden administration. The reason why past administrations were reluctant to call a spade and just acknowledge what happened historically is there was a lot more cooperation at stake with Turkey, and it was just easiest not to rock the boat too much. But between the U.S. losing interest in Syria, between the fact that they've already had all sorts of tension over Incirlik Air Base and so forth, between the fact that last year things went sour over the S-400s and everything else, and between the fact that in reality, bringing Turkey into the EU and further more deeply incorporating them into the European project is sort of a non-starter at this point. The U.S.-Turkish relations were already going to be uneasy. There's a little bit less at stake than there used to be for the time being. And so I think it kind of made sense for the Biden administration just to give up the dance of pretending what happened didn't happen and just sort of allow Turkish-U.S. relations to move forward from here on, and so, without this, complication and potential flashpoint.
And does the Turkish government see it the same way?
It seems unlikely to me that there's going to make a major material difference for either government either way. And in fact, honestly, Ankara might be fine with this from the standpoint of Erdogan can point to it and as a way of bolstering his point of view, or his claims politically that look, Turkey must rise for itself. It is under attack constantly by enemies in the West and everywhere else, and so it's something he can play to and distract from some of his other political problems. Since there's not really any material consequences that I know of at this point. It really just allows both sides to move forward.
Philip Orchard in Austin, thanks very much. And now to Moscow, where Ekaterina Zolotova is waiting to give us a steer on the fundamentals of Russian geopolitics. Russia has the largest landmass of any country in the world, and it stretches from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. Ekaterina, how does this unique geography affect it?
When we're talking about Russian geography, we should identify some features of this geography. So the first one is, as you mentioned, is the huge territory. Russia has expanded its territory for several hundred years, especially since Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar. And now it occupies, I suppose, about 1/7 or maybe a little bit less of the Earth lands. Although Russia lost some important territories after the collapse of Soviet Union, it remains the largest country in the world. So this is the first feature, the largest country in the world. The second feature is that Russia is located on 2 continents, and it includes 2 civilizations, European and Asian. Russian scientists often like to mention these characteristics, and they like to argue about it, since historically Russia is not very part of Asia, and at the same time, geographically, it is not exactly the Europe. The third feature that I would like to mention is that Russia lost some territories due to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and these former states with warmer climate and fertile lands of big country, I call big country the Soviet Union, and early it was Russian Empire. These countries became foreign states with different degrees of proximity and friendship towards Kremlin. At this moment, the Russian Federation is located to the north of its predecessors, the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire. So a lot of lands are located in rather unfavorable climate conditions, and this significantly slows down the development of the country, in my opinion. Well, at least it slows down the agricultural sector. The fourth characteristic that I would like to mention is that Russia remains a landlocked country. Russia has lack of direct access to the world oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic. Yes, Russia has a lot of access to different seas, and it has access to Arctics, but at the same time, it doesn't really help Russia because the seas are frozen in winter, and Russia can't use it for navigation. So looking at all of these features, geographical features, we can understand Russian geographical and Russian major imperatives. The first one is to ensure access to warm seas and oceans. The second is to increase its influence and presence in the countries that were previously included in the Soviet Union, because they have huge territories, they have resources, and they have fertile and warm lands. And the final one is to preserve the country's unity over such vast territory. This is really hard task.
Now, its economy is largely based on oil exports, isn't it? Tell us a bit about the Russian economy and what drives it.
Yes, sure. You're absolutely correct. Russian economy is based mostly on oil and gas. But I would like to mention 2 characteristics of Russian economy, also like 2 features. So the first one is the relatively slow economic development. Russia is desperately looking for the ways to reduce some lag between Russian economy and the Western countries and developed countries, but it is very difficult to do so. The reason is Russian dependence on oil and gas, as you mentioned. Oil and gas and petroleum products are the major export goods for Russia. These products and these goods are the source of cash that comes into the economy from export. It's also an important source of money to the federal budget and to reserve fund. So this is quite important for Russia. The second characteristic, it's internal one, but it's also very important when we talk about Russian economy, is a rather high level of poverty. Well, of course, according to official data, the poverty is about 13%, which is not very high compared with some countries. But at the same time, the level of poverty can be higher than official statistics show, simply because of different mathematical formulas that you use to count this poverty. Russia faces the problem of declining of real wages a long time. This really becomes the major issue, how to make the real wages grow and how to increase the salary and how to increase the productivity. So Russia, as we mentioned before, it's an extremely large country with many regions and with many nations. And each of these regions has different access to resources and capital. So it is not surprising that the income of the citizens of these regions is different. The salaries and the incomes in different regions differ significantly. For example, from Moscow, if we compare the city Tver, that is not so far from Moscow, and we compare Moscow, we'll see the big difference between the salaries. The Russian economy faces a so-called vicious circle, as I call it. Russia needs to diversify and reduce dependence on oil, because these oil dependence make it very vulnerable to external changes and to oil price fluctuations. At the same time, in order to preserve the unity of the territories and the country, the Kremlin needs to redistribute the income between different regions, as well as to make some direct payments to the population in order to ensure that their quality of life is growing. So this measure requires a lot of money. And Russia receives this money from extraction and export of oil. So in this regard, the model of Russian economy is not very easy to change. In our daily work in GPF, we observe the condition of Russian economy very attentively because this inequality and this decrease of income and I'm speaking about income of population and the government as well, they really can cause instability in Russia.
Now, the military, I mean, compared to other powers, Russia's military is proportionately probably larger on a ratio of its economy to military. Why is it so large? What's the significance of the military in Russia?
After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia was left with unprotected borders. And of course, at that time, the very important imperative for Russia was to strengthen these borders and to increase defense capacity. Historically, the military threat to Russia came from the West. In modern conditions, it is the NATO countries. But now it is worth to considering that the geography of tension is expanding to the north and to the east. I'm speaking about the Arctic, for example. Also now the Ukrainian crisis triggered the tension between Russia, the United States, and the European Union. So that's why Russia needs to have a very strong defense system, and it has to have a very strong military. At the same time, Russia least of all wants to get involved into any war, but nevertheless it's constantly training and it is constantly strengthening its troops in all directions. Russia has been working hard for several years to modernize the army, and in my opinion, this army modernization is proceeding quite successfully. Russia is also testing new weapons in various conditions. I mean, for example, in Syria and in the Arctic, and military profession is becoming prestigious and quite popular among Russians.
Ekaterina, finally, let's just have a look a bit further ahead from a bit more of a broad perspective. I mean, what is Russia's sort of current outlook and strategic intentions? What's most important to Vladimir Putin right now?
Well, Russia had a lot of plans before coronavirus, but since pandemic came, so Russia had changed a little bit its short-term goals. Now Russia, like all other countries in the world, is looking for the ways to restore the economy after the pandemic. Overall, Russia survived the pandemic significantly better than predicted. For example, Russian GDP contracted less than expected. Russia managed to save the money of reserve fund. The unemployment and inflation remained stable. To sum up about the current status of Russia, we should mention that Russian economy has managed to survive, but at the same time, it is very difficult to pick up the speed of growth. So right now, this is the most important task for the government and for Putin as well, to give the speed to the economy and to increase the real wages of people. In addition to this, Russia is under pressure due to the anti-Russian sanctions and general tense relations with the West on a number of different issues. And at the same time, Russia is not planning to make any concessions. There are a lot of constraints for Russia, but Russia is struggling to keep the country united, and it wants to increase its influence in different regions.
Ekaterina Zolotova, thank you so much for your time. If you want to read anything by Ekaterina, you can do so by signing up to Geopolitical Futures. She writes regularly and very, very well, might I add, on Russia and the Eurasia region. And you can do that by going to geopoliticalfutures.com/podcast.
Talking Geopolitics is brought to you by Geopolitical Futures, your source for geopolitical forecasting and analysis.
George Friedman left Hungary as a baby, sneaking across the Danube, under the Iron Curtain, and away from the Soviet Union's clutches, quite literally in his mother's arms. The barbed wire fences may now be gone, but Moscow's external relations are still largely driven by the same desire to hold sway over its neighbours. To discuss this mentality and how it affects Russia's relations with the rest of the world, I sat down with George for this episode's fireside chat, just a few hours after Vladimir Putin had begun withdrawing his troops from the Ukrainian border. George, many in the West would say that Russia is an aggressive country. The stacking of military forces in Ukraine, as we'll come on to later, or on the Ukrainian border, is a good example. But what is fundamental to Russians is this idea of buffer zones on its border. Why is that?
Well, remember that Russia has been invaded in the 17th century by the Swedes, in the 19th century by the French, in the 20th century twice by the Germans. And in each case, they won the war or survived the war, in the case, by having strategic depth. In other words, it took a long time for anyone to get to where they're going. And in that time, the Russians could organize, impose attrition on them, and so on. So this is how Russia survives. It's a country that has been facing a lot of predators, and it's a country that needs strategic depth, distance, partly because it'll slow the enemy down, partly because there's a chance to attack them. So for this reason, it lost its strategic depth when the Soviet Union fell and all the parts of the Soviet Union became independent. And that is a priority for the Russians to try to reconstruct that because they need it.
Do we see many other countries in the 21st century now, or at least, nuclear powers, major powers, do we see them being that concerned about, being invaded like they may have done in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries? Or at the very least, using that as such a driving foreign policy strategy? Is Russia unique in that way?
The United States is that way. The United States has strategic depth. It has the two oceans, Atlantic and the Pacific, both of which it dominates. And one of the real issues for the United States in facing China, for example, is not microchips nearly as much as making sure that the Chinese don't move into the Western Pacific, where we fought with the Japanese to gain that. Because of the fact that we don't have any neighbors that can attack us, the Canadians probably won't, and the Mexicans won't, anyone who attacks us must come through the oceans. And we are quite obsessed with control of the sea. It is one of the characteristics. It's the military service that most money is spent on. So we have to understand that the United States has it. The reason it's not noticed, it's been very successful. Ever since World War II, it drove the British out of North America, which was one of the things it wanted. And it also prevented the Germans from entering. During the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis was about entering the Western Hemisphere, violating strategic depth, and threatening the United States with missiles. So the fact is that strategic depth matters to the United States. It matters to Russia. It matters to China in the sense that they don't want to see anybody push into Tibet, for example, or push into Xinjiang or wherever. So all countries want to have defensible borders because they don't know what's going to happen.
You touched on it there as well, which is coming on to my second question, which is, okay, well, I mean, that may be, but I mean, there are plenty of other countries out there that don't have strategic depth in the sense that, I mean, you might look at Germany doesn't have strategic depth in the sense it doesn't have a buffer zone around it. Now, you might say that the French, for example, are very friendly towards the Germans now, or the Polish are friendlier than they used to be. But I mean, is this really just the Cold War mentality still talking? I mean, why is Russia worried about being invaded? Who in the 21st century wants to invade them?
If you, in 1930, asked that question, people would laugh. Who could? Germany can't. Well, between 1932 and 1938, 6 years, Germany built up a massive military and an utterly different regime than existed before, Hitler instead of Weimar. And they did invade Russia. There's an idea that goes around that somehow there's a static structure of the international system. It's highly dynamic. We've seen how Germany, for example, came together in 1871 and became aggressively the most efficient economic power in Europe, threatening France, threatening Russia, threatening Britain. So in the space of a generation or less, the intent of nations can change, the regimes of nations can change. Wars are common. Periods of absolute peace are rare. And the thing to remember is that since the 17th century, since the nation states started to work, we had a major war at least once every century. And none of them were really expected to be major wars. Nobody expected World War I to look the way it looked. And that was a complete shock to everyone. Nobody expected Napoleon to try to take Russia, and nobody expected him to lose. So history is filled with surprises if you don't look at the pattern. And the pattern you have to look at is that in every century, a major systemic war of great powers takes place. The 21st century may be the first one in hundreds of years that doesn't have that war, but I'd be very surprised. And the Russians have a long memory. They have miscalculated on the capabilities and intentions of their enemies for many times, and they just don't want to do it again.
And Russia's geography in its place on the European plain is quite significant when we talk about being invaded, isn't it?
The European peninsula is one of the wealthiest areas in the world. And by the peninsula, I mean that area west of Russia. It has created systemically over and over again major aggressive powers. Okay? They've had periods when that wasn't the case, after the Congress of Vienna, for example, after the First World War, but it always shifts. Because the problem is there's about 52 independent nation states in an area that's incredibly small. And the friction level is enormous. We have to remember that in Yugoslavia, in our time in 1990s, 100,000 people died. That's part of Europe, although Europe would like to pretend it's not. The Balkans were a terrible place. So just a few years ago, we had a war that killed 100,000 people. So while many people look at Europe as being peaceful, well, parts of it are peaceful. Parts of it are very bloody. Russia's problem with Europe is that the North European plain, which runs from France to Moscow, is flat, easily traversed, with very few places to block people. There are no raging rivers that are blocking anyone, no mountain chains, nothing like that. So that's the attack line that you're going to expect through Poland. That's the one that historically has taken place. And this is why, because of that terrain, that the Russians need strategic depth, because you can drive a car there very fast, on better roads, of course, but you can really move very quickly if you're an army over there. So the enemy will move quickly, but if there's enough time to organize a defense, the Russians have consistently won. And the whole issue here is to make sure there's that time.
Last week we spoke about the Chinese-Russian relationship. Let's go west to where we are now in Europe. What is the status of that relationship between Russia and Europe and the EU, which are, of course, two very different things? Europe and the EU are not one and the same.
Well, and that's the point. You can't speak of, first of all, EU is not a military organization. It doesn't control the foreign policy of nations. Poland is extremely suspicious of the Russians. They are allied with the Americans. The Americans have tanks there. Romania, similarly. Those countries are former Soviet satellites, if you will. These countries are very worried about Russia and equally worried about Europe, particularly worried about Germany, which is oblivious to this threat. And they feel, sort of treating this matter indifferently. Other parts of Europe, the Germans don't want, obviously, to have another war. They want to be able to deal with the Russians, but they're caught with the Americans because the United States still has, I think, 40,000 troops in Germany defending it. And that means that whether or not Germany gets into a war really depends on what the Americans want. So it's a very, very complicated situation that can't stand. I mean, you cannot have a united economy and a disunited foreign policy because the two intersect in many different ways. And that's one of the problems with the Europeans, which is that they have not faced this issue. Now, their idea is if they ignore the issue, it'll go away. It'll just get worse. So the foreign policy of France and the foreign policy of Germany are now diverging. But the economic policies are to some extent still aligned. So we really do have to talk about individual countries. There is no European policy toward Russia. There are a series of different policies. Portugal, for example, doesn't have a Russia policy. It doesn't need one. It's the other end of Europe. Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, these all have to have relations. The Czechs just revealed that the Russian intelligence service, the Spetsnaz, blew up a Czech ammunition dump. They just now captured or claimed to have captured people who were involved in that. But these things are going on every day in Europe, while the Europeans to the west are obsessed with the central bank's interest rates, and the Europeans to the east are obsessed with the Russians.
Let's talk about that for a second, because that Czech story is a very interesting one. I mean, Russia has stirred up trouble quite often in recent years, particularly with Western countries in particular, I would say, or perhaps that's just me because I'm based in the West and I notice that more. But I mean, look, it meddled in the US elections in 2016 and 2020. It poisoned a former Russian spy in Salisbury in the UK in 2018. Just down the road from where you are, George, in Austin, Texas, Russia hacked into a company called SolarWinds and then used that hack to try and launch a wider attack in the US and on US government agencies. And I think what's often really interesting about this sort of disruptor-in-chief attitude is that they do it in unsubtle ways. They do it in ways so that we know it was them. Why are they so keen on being so disruptive?
In their position, they're arguing that they were not the ones who started this. For example, interfering in elections. They charged that the United States, using its intelligence service, undermined the constitutional president of Ukraine, forced him out of the country, and created a pro-Western regime. Now, what happened there, we can all argue, but their view is the United States began involving themselves in internal affairs of countries with the color revolutions that began. And their view of the involvement in the internet is, hey, the internet is free. All we did was plant stories that were lies about you. You do that about us all the time. We have to remember that, yes, they hacked our systems. The United States has a entity called the National Security Agency, whose job is electronic warfare. They have an enormous budget. I mean, enormous. One would hope that they're doing something useful. So the Chinese, for example, have claimed that the Americans are constantly hacking them. Now, the difference is that the Americans, if they hack China or particularly Russia, the Americans won't say they've done it, and the Russians won't admit that they've done it because it's humiliating. On the other hand, the Americans love to parade a Russian attack. So what we have is a situation where everybody's hacking everybody else. some more successfully, some not successfully. Russia wants it to be known. It left all sorts of evidence that they did that. The Americans wouldn't want it known. This is not to justify Russia or anything else, but it's to understand that these are nation states pursuing their own interest. And each of them is fairly aggressive in pursuing the direction they want. And Ukraine was really the breakpoint for the Russians. Because in Ukraine, they felt that the president was elected. He was. The president was constitutionally pushed out of office, or more important, on a Sunday morning, the Constitution was changed to push him out of office. That this was an American coup d'etat, and they say anything they do to the Americans is fair play. And they're doing it.
Let's come on to Ukraine in just 1 second, but just one follow-up question to that. If everyone's in this sense acting in their national interest, I could ask you the question, why is everyone doing it? And I imagine there are different answers, but let's just look at Russia. Why is Russia then doing it? What's their national interest in doing these things?
Russia's history was the collapse of an empire that was created in the 18th century. It fragmented into many different pieces. Much of the problem was internal Russian dynamic. Their view is that the United States took every advantage it could of the disintegration, of, for example, moving into Georgia in the Caucasus, is giving aid to many of these regimes. So they went through this disintegration, and where their view is the United States should have let it lie there, the United States, they claim, took advantage of it. All right? And, there's some justification, but, nations do that because the United States did it because they didn't want to have another Cold War. They don't want Russia to be on the border of Poland and Romania and so on. It doesn't want to have to deploy once again there, and it wants to keep Russia as far away as possible. So the United States has a defensive reason. It does not want another Cold War. The Russians have a defensive reason. They want strategic depth, that they don't want their country broken apart and dominated by the United States. And therein lies the tale. Both sides have legitimate interests, and they collide.
All right, well, let's talk about Ukraine. At the time of recording, Russia now seems to be withdrawing its troops from the border after stacking them there over the past several weeks. If they're now going home, what was the point of it in the first place?
Traditionally, foreign countries try to gut check an new American president. What's he made out of? What's he going to do? What's he capable of? And they test him. I think the Taiwan story is a test of Biden. I think the question of Ukraine was a test of the United States. I don't think Russia had any intention of invading. First, the troops are not in the right position for that. They're in the wrong place. But more than that, Ukraine is a huge country. It's a huge country, and even if there was no opposition whatsoever, they would take weeks, in the best case circumstance, to go into the country, and then months, years to pacify it. So the Russians were not going to do that because in addition to that, the one thing that would resurrect NATO, resurrect the European commitment to NATO, would be this sort of attack. They want decent relations with the Europeans. They want to split the Europeans from the Americans. This would drive them together. So what they were trying to do here is to demonstrate, one, that they could potentially do it. Secondly, to see if Biden and his staff panic over what's going on, or if they handle it quietly, and then pull back. I don't think they ever expected to have to invade or want to invade Ukraine. It just was too big a challenge.
George, as always, thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much.
That's all for this episode of Talking Geopolitics. We'll be back again in 2 weeks. But until then, thanks for listening and take care.
You've been listening to Talking Geopolitics from the team at Geopolitical Futures. If you like what you've heard, be sure to subscribe to Talking Geopolitics wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love to hear your comments and questions. Go to geopoliticalfutures.com/podcast to leave your feedback. That's geopoliticalfutures.com/podcast.